Hi guys, welcome to my Night Stories Sleep YouTube channel. Today I want to say, how did frontier families sleep through the coldest nights without freezing? Tonight we settle into a cabin buried in snowdrifts, the roof sagging under frozen weight, the wind keening across empty plains. You step inside and feel a blast of cold air, the kind that steals your breath before you can even close the rough-hewn door. Outside, the night presses in, and you realize without warmth, you probably won't survive this. Frontier families didn't just face discomfort, they lived with the constant awareness that a single bitter night could undo them. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know your location and local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights. You crouch down in this one-room cabin, hearing the crunch of snow still clinging to your boots. The smell of resinous pine logs lingers where someone cut firewood earlier. Shadows stretch across rough timber walls. Families like this had no central heating, no radiators humming in the corner, just stone hearths, smoky chimneys, and the constant hope that embers would last until dawn. You press your palms together and exhale, imagining the sting of frost inside your chest, the ache of trying to breathe while icicles form on window panes. The mainstream fact is plain. Pioneers and settlers in North America regularly endured winter nights when temperatures dropped far below freezing. Yet their cabins, hastily built of logs or sod, rarely sealed tight. No insulation, no glass windows, just gaps that let in drafts sharp as knives. Quilts, blankets, and sheer stubbornness stood between them and frostbite. And still, historians still argue whether those families actually managed comfortable sleep at all, or whether nights were spent half awake, shivering, turning like rotisserie chickens to keep both sides from stiffening. You glance toward a corner where a straw mattress rests. No plush bedding here, just dried grasses laid on wooden boards, sometimes stuffed in a ticking sack. The faint rustle might hide mice, another unwelcome roommate. But against the unforgiving chill, even this scratchy bedding felt like a gift. Families layered blankets, feather quilts if they were lucky, sometimes even animal hides, piling everything heavy enough to pin sleepers down. Now, picture the quirky tidbit. Archaeologists have found accounts of settlers mixing cow dung with clay to plaster cabin walls. Not exactly glamorous interior design, but this crust sealed cracks and kept freezing wind at bay. You can almost smell it, earthy and acrid. A strange noise echoes in the distance, a coyote's calls, riding the icy wind. Inside, children whisper lullabies, voices thin with sleep and shivers. The adults pull them closer, everyone pressed shoulder to shoulder. You hear the rasp of breath, the muffled cough, the creak of wooden joints under too many bodies on one frame. Imagine now stepping out briefly into the darkness. Your boots crunch hard, the snow almost glowing under moonlight. You tilt your head back, watching stars scatter like frozen sparks across the sky. The air slices into your lungs, and for a moment you feel the fragile miracle of simply being warm enough to stand here. Then, teeth chattering, you rush back in, slamming the door against the night. Frontier families carried this nightly rhythm, banking fires, piling bedding, huddling close. Parents listened for the telltale silence that meant embers had died, then dragged themselves from bed to stir the hearth, coaxing faint orange to life again. And still, morning often arrived with frozen water pails, frost tracing delicate lace over window shutters, and children reluctant to leave their fragile cocoons. So, as you lie back and let the cabin's shadows fold over you, you can almost feel what it was to sleep through the coldest nights without freezing to death. It wasn't luxury, it was endurance, invention, and togetherness stitched into every weary breath. You settled deeper into the story, letting your thoughts drift toward the earliest challenge frontier families faced, the very walls around them. Building a winter shelter wasn't just carpentry. It was the difference between living to see spring or slipping silently into the snow. Imagine yourself standing in a clearing, surrounded by towering pines, your breath hanging in the air like a ghost. You've got nothing but an axe, rough hands, and maybe a neighbor or two to help. How do you create a home that won't betray you when the blizzard comes rattling at the door? The mainstream historical fact is this: log cabins became the quintessential structure of frontier survival in early America. Settlers felled trees, trimmed branches, and dragged the heavy logs into place, stacking them in rough squares. The cracks between was stuffed with whatever material could be gathered: moss, clay, mud, even animal hair. This process, called chinking, was crude but crucial. Without it, icy drafts would whistle through the gaps, turning a cabin into a frozen wind tunnel. Now, here's a quirky tidbit. Some settlers swore by using rags soaked in bacon grease as a sealant, pressed into the crevices between logs. You touch the bark, rough, uneven, but solid. Each log bears the marks of sweat and urgency. Historians still debate whether these cabins were truly efficient at keeping out the cold, or if they simply slowed the inevitable seep of freezing air. But one thing is certain: they provided psychological comfort. A family could sit inside and say, "We've built a roof between us and the storm." That hope alone was its own warmth. The roof often carried its own tale. Shingles cut by hand from cedar or oak were nailed down in overlapping layers. Some families, lacking nails or proper tools, weighted the shingles with stones or tied bundles with rawhide. If snow piled too heavy, the roof groaned under its burden and sometimes collapsed entirely. Imagine lying in bed, listening to the creaks above, praying that the sound stayed steady instead of snapping in the night. Inside, the floor was often nothing more than the bare earth. Some households tamped it down with heavy stones, smoothing it until it became hard as concrete. Others laid flat boards if the family had the tools and time. You crouched down and touched that cold surface, realizing how quickly it must have sucked warmth from toes and blankets. Families spread straw or rushes, sometimes even dried leaves beneath rugs to make a buffer. Each addition was an act of defiance against the earth's chill. Think of the sheer time investment. It could take weeks to raise a cabin, even with help, and yet the settlers knew they had no choice. Winter wasn't patient. You picture a family racing against the shortening days of autumn, children gathering moss for chinking, mothers stirring big pots of stew over outdoor fires, fathers hauling logs until shoulders ached. The pace wasn't optional. The cold would arrive whether they were ready or not. Now, let's pause for a moment of sensory imagination. You step outside, brushing sawdust from your coat, and the air is sharp enough to make your nostrils sting. All around you, the forest hums with silence, broken only by the crack of splitting wood. You can almost smell the pine sap, sticky and resinous, mixed with the earthy tang of freshly dug clay. There's no hum of traffic, no glow of streetlights, just you, the cabin, and the creeping certainty of winter pressing closer, each day. One odd practice whispered in some settlers' journals tells of lining cabin interiors with newspapers when they could be spared, not for reading, but for insulation. Whole pages of local gazettes were pasted against walls, creating a strange collage of headlines, sermon notes, and lost and found ads that doubled as a barrier against wind. It must have looked like a patchwork museum exhibit. By candlelight, children sometimes traced the printed letters before bed, eyes heavy with sleep, as the news became both decoration and shield. Historians still argue whether early frontier families borrowed more techniques from indigenous neighbors than their own traditions admitted. Many native groups had centuries of knowledge about building snug shelters in freezing climates, from bark-covered wigwams to
earth lodges. Some settlers learned and adopted ideas like packing snow against the base of cabins to block drafts. Yet in letters and journals, these borrowings were often downplayed, as if acknowledging them undermined the settlers' pride and self-reliance. Still, the fingerprints of shared knowledge are visible if you look closely. At night, once walls stood firm and the roof sealed overhead, the family would gather by the fireplace. The cabin's corners might still sigh with cold air, but the logs now stood as sentinels against the storm. You listen as a child giggles under a quilt while the father checks the chinking by candlelight, pressing more moss into any suspicious cracks. The mother sets down a basket of wool socks by the hearth, her hands red from washing them in icy water. Every detail feels humble, ordinary, yet stitched together into a tapestry of survival. Imagine what it felt like that first night in a brand new cabin. After weeks of work, after endless worry, the family finally lies on straw pallets, quilts tucked high. The walls creak but hold. The wind howls outside, but no longer slices directly across their faces. A faint fire glows, casting shadows like soft brushstrokes across log walls. For the first time, they can close their eyes without watching for snow piling directly on their blankets. That moment of relief must have tasted sweeter than any luxury. The quirky details don't end there. In some frontier diaries, you read about families who painted the insides of their cabins with milk and lime, partly for brightness, partly because they believed it discouraged insects and rot. The pale wash reflected candlelight, making rooms feel less gloomy and perhaps, at least psychologically, warmer. You picture flickering light bouncing off whitewashed logs, transforming a cramped cabin into a small, glowing sanctuary against the dark wilderness outside. But even as you admire this ingenuity, you remember the fragility. Fire could undo all that effort in an instant. A single spark onto a straw mattress could send flames racing up the log walls, undoing months of work and leaving only ashes in the snow. Families slept with one ear tuned to the crackle of the hearth, grateful for its warmth, yet wary of its danger. Survival on the frontier was always a gamble. Victory one night didn't guarantee the next. Still, as you imagine lying back on that rough mattress, the cabin's walls steady around you, there's a kind of peace in the thought. Yes, the logs are uneven, the air still sharp, the bedding thin, but you know without these walls, frontier people adapted with quiet determination. They discovered that even the humblest of coverings, straw, rushes, or worn textiles, could make the difference between misery and tolerable rest. One well-documented reality of those households is that earthen floors dominated frontier interiors, especially in the first years after settlement. Cutting planks required sawmills, and sawmills required time, tools, and a community with resources. Families in isolated regions simply couldn't manage cushioning, but for its insulating quality. Every week or two, the straw was replaced, becoming a cycle of fresh scents, mingling with smoke and cooking. Imagine the faint rustle underfoot as children tiptoe across the room, straw crunching softly in the dim candlelight. Over time, this bedding wasn't just comfort, it became a kind of hygiene measure too, soaking up spills and ash. Of course, mice and insects found it delightful as well, darting beneath the layers like unwanted roommates. Researchers remain divided on the frontier memories of sleeping on corn husks. Laid out on the ground, if you press your hand into such bedding, you'd feel the crunch, the uneven give, the bits poking through the cloth. Over time, the husks broke down into dust, and the sacks needed refilling. It wasn't exactly a luxury mattress, but to settlers it was better than lying straight on frozen soil. Those who were lucky enough to own sheep sometimes mixed in wool. Those near marshes harvested reeds. Families innovated with whatever the landscape offered. The sensory details of such an arrangement field came out smoother, somewhat shinier surface that resisted dust. Children sometimes skated toy pebbles across it, pretending it was ice. The faint gleam by candlelight made the one-room dwelling feel a fraction more finished, almost civilized amid the wilderness outside. Meanwhile, the bedding arrangements grew inventive. Families often slept in layers. First, a sack of straw on the floor, then a quilt, then everyone piled together under heavy blankets. If the house had a bed frame, it was usually reserved for the parents, while children lay on straw sacks. Some recall nights of snug security, others of coughing children and aching bones from the chill. And yet, these homes didn't stand still in their ingenuity. As soon as nails or saws were available, many households improved their floors. Split logs were laid flat, sometimes called puncheon floors, rough but raised above the earth. Families without tools used packed clay, smoothed with water and ashes. Over time, they upgraded again, adding planks, then rugs, then feather beds if fortune comes.
Not because you are comfortable, but because exhaustion insists and because you trust the fragile rituals that families refine through generations. It's worth pausing to imagine the morning after, when dawn crept in through shutter cracks. Frost often outlined the bedding where breath condensed and froze. Straw scattered the floor as children clambered out, rubbing their eyes, leaving little trails across the dirt. Parents shook out the bedding, checked for damp patches, and sometimes felt like a test of endurance. There is something strangely tender in that, the recognition that even hardship carries its own nostalgia once it's safely behind you. So as you drift further into the story, picture yourself lying down again on that layered straw bed, the floor beneath you, hard but softened by ingenuity, the cabin groaning gently around you. You're not comfortable, but you're alive, and that simple fact is the victory. Tomorrow, you'll replace the straw, smooth the floor, and prepare.
Frozen solid, where frost coated the walls like lace, and where breath crystallized in midair. One curious detail tucked into old letters tells of children assigned to fire watch duty, their small bodies wrapped in quilts, sitting near the hearth to ensure the glow never faded too low. Imagine the drooping eyes of a child swaying in half-sleep, poking at embers with a stick, while outside the wind screamed against the shutters. In households without older children, parents took turns, dozing in shifts so the hearth would not betray them. Experts disagree about the precise methods families use to maximize warmth from such modest fires. Some accounts describe stacking rocks in the hearth, allowing them to absorb heat, then moving them near bedsides. Others insist that carefully chosen wood, hickory or oak, burned longer and hotter, reducing the risk of a midnight freeze. Either way, the fire became not just a source of heat, but a carefully managed tool requiring daily knowledge and care. Now take a sensory step closer. You hear the steady crackle, feel the pulse of heat on your cheeks while your back still aches from the chill of the cabin. The smell of smoke clings to your hair and clothes, a perfume you never quite escape. Sparks jump occasionally, a small warning that bedding drawn too close could mean disaster. You can almost hear the coughing of children inhaling smoky air, their lungs raw yet their bodies warmer than they would have been otherwise. Some families grew inventive with their hearths. One unusual practice was to rake ashes into a mound at the back of the fireplace, then bury glowing coals beneath. This created a slow-burning heat source that could be revived in the morning. Others learned to position a flat iron or brick on the hearth, heating it, then wrapping it in cloth and slipping it between quilts. These glowing stones carried warmth into the deepest hours of night, radiating comfort where firelight could not reach. There is ongoing debate among researchers about whether chimneys of early cabins helped or hindered survival. Poorly built stone chimneys leaked heat as quickly as they funneled smoke away, and some collapsed under snow or wind. Others argue that without chimneys, smoke buildup would have suffocated families long before frostbite could. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. Survival meant balancing risk, smoke, stung eyes, and coughing throats against the chill that could stop a heart. Imagine for a moment the sound surrounding you in such a night. The fire pops, wood shifts, a log sighs into flame. Beyond that, silence. Outside, snow muffles the landscape. Bodies that needed heat most were guarded by those with greater resilience. This image of rings of humanity, heads toward the flames and feet toward the cold walls, is haunting and strangely beautiful. At times, desperation led to risky experiments. Diaries mentioned attempts to burn green wood, which hissed and smoked but refused to yield much heat. Others describe gathering dried dung from cattle or buffalo, burning it slowly like coal. The smell was acrid, filling the cabin with a bitterness that clung to clothes and hair. Yet when temperatures plunged, people burned what they had, preferring stench to silence. Morning often told the tale of how well the fire had served. If embers still glowed under ash, the day began with gratitude. If the hearth lay cold and dead, the family scrambled for flint and steel, striking sparks onto charred cloth or tinder. Failure meant trudging through snow to a neighbor's cabin, begging for a glowing coal to carry home in a covered pan. You can almost feel the humiliation, grown men pleading for a scrap of someone else's fire, their pride bent under the weight of survival. Yet there was comfort too. The fire became a kind of companion, its rhythms woven into family memory. Children grew up associating its flicker with safety, the glow marking the boundary between life and peril. One settler's memoir described falling asleep to the sound of wood snapping in the hearth as the lullaby of the wilderness. Another remembered the glow on his parents' faces, their expressions soft as they depended on the closeness of human bodies, the pooling of breath, the shared cocoon of quilts, the steady heat radiating from skin. It wasn't only affection that drew families together at night, it was necessity. Surviving letters and journals make it clear that many households shared a single bed, or at least a single sleeping space. Parents, children, and sometimes visiting relatives or boarders crowded under one heavy pile of blankets. It was practical. The more bodies in contact, the less each individual had to fight against the cold. You imagine lying in a crowded bed, your shoulder pressed against a sibling's, the edge of a quilt tugged this way and that by restless feet. Comfort wasn't a priority, survival was. An offbeat detail that emerges in frontier accounts is that families often slept head to toe, arranging themselves alternately so that one person's feet pressed against the next person's head. It sounds awkward, but this odd choreography minimized space and maximized warmth, turning a bed into a puzzle of limbs and quilts. Children especially remembered this pattern with a mix of humor and resentment. Who wouldn't complain about waking to a brother's icy toes against their cheek? Modern scholarship continues to wrestle with how culturally acceptable such closeness really felt. Some argue that in communities used to large extended families and shared labor, there was little embarrassment about huddling together at night. Others suggest that as soon as households had the resources, they rushed to separate sleeping quarters, craving privacy.
Much as comfort, the truth, perhaps, is that necessity outweighed preference, and cultural norms bent under the pressure of freezing winters. Let your senses fill the scene. The air inside the bed canopy is warmer, filled with the mingled smell of wool, straw, and breath. Quilts weigh heavily on your chest, pressing you into the mattress. You hear the sound of slow breathing, the cough of someone fighting a cold, the occasional creak of the bed frame. Outside, wind claws at the shutters, but inside, the nest of bodies feels like a single organism, every heartbeat contributing to the fragile warmth. Curiously, some households included not just family, but hired hands or neighbors in this shared sleep. A traveler might be invited to squeeze into a bed if storms made the journey home impossible. Hospitality in such times wasn't just kindness, it was the only way to ensure everyone made it through the night. Imagine the awkward politeness of strangers sliding under the same quilt, the first minutes filled with stiff silence before fatigue and cold erased boundaries. Folklore and memory preserve stories of children whispering to each other in the dark, inventing games to distract from the numbness creeping into their toes. They told riddles, sang snatches of songs, or listened to tales whispered by parents about warmer lands. These nighttime rituals became part of the fabric of survival, shared warmth wrapped not only in quilts, but also in words. There's still disagreement among researchers about just how common multifamily sleeping really was. Some diaries mention it constantly, while others insist on separate pallets or lofts. Geography played a role. In harsher northern climates, communal beds were more likely, while in milder regions, families sometimes risked the luxury of space. The debate underscores how flexible survival strategies could be, bending to the demands of weather, resources, and culture. Now, picture the quilt itself, heavy, patchworked, stitched from scraps of old dresses, coats, or flour sacks. Feathers, if available, puffed its interior, but more often it was simply layer upon layer of fabric sewn tight. You run your fingers over uneven stitches, each one a mark of care. These blankets weren't bought in stores, they were survival tools made by hands that knew cold all too well.
One unusual practice, recalled in Scandinavian immigrant families, was to hang fur pelts over quilts, creating a final shield against icy air. Deer hides, bear skins, or even sheep fleeces turned into makeshift duvets. The smell of animal lingered in the fibers, mingling with smoke and sweat, but the warmth was undeniable. Children sometimes fought over who got the good fur, the one that smelled less pungent or felt softer to the touch. The intimacy of these arrangements carried psychological weight. In the darkest nights, pressed so closely together, families found reassurance. Even when the wind howled outside, even when snow drifted high against the door, they had each other's heat. That bond, forged by survival, shaped memories of childhood for decades to come. Some memoirs recall distracting children from the bite of the cold. Each touch, each whispered word, each sigh under heavy quilts was a calculated act of endurance, stitched seamlessly into family life. As you sink into this image, let yourself feel the press of those quilts, the weight of shared breath, and the small miracle of body heat keeping frost at bay. It isn't glamorous, it isn't private, but it is survival. And in the stillness of the night, it is enough. You linger in that crowded bed for a moment longer, quilts piled high, bodies pressed close, until you notice the stitching and the fabric itself. Those layers weren't simply bought, they were earned, stitched, patched, and repurposed from every scrap a household could muster. On the frontier, bedding became both art and armor, holding together families against the long assault of winter. Surviving records from household inventories confirm just how prized feather beds, wool blankets, and quilts were. A feather mattress filled with goose or duck down could keep sleepers warm even when ice spread across the inside of windows. Quilts sewn from worn-out clothing told the history of the family through fabric. A piece of a child's first dress might sit beside a square from a father's discarded work shirt. When stitched together, the quilt became a living chronicle as well as a shield. One little-known custom among some rural households was the trundle quilt, deliberately made oversized so it could spill across the floor, sealing the gap where icy drafts crept under the bed. Historians argue that the feather bed became a symbol of status on the frontier, a mark that a family had secured enough flocks or trade to afford such comfort. Let your senses explore the bedding more closely. Run your hands over a quilt's uneven stitches, the fabric softened by years of use. The smell is a blend of smoke from the fire, soap from the occasional wash, and the faint mustiness of damp cloth that never quite dries in winter. When you slide under it, the weight presses you down comfortingly, cocooning you against the drafts that prowl the corners of the room. Curiously, in certain immigrant traditions, quilts carried spiritual meaning as well as physical warmth. Scandinavian families sometimes embroidered protective symbols into the corners, believing the stitching warded off misfortune during the long nights. German settlers spoke of spirit threads, bits of red yarn woven through quilts to guard children from illness. These details remind you that bedding wasn't only a practical tool, it was woven with memory, belief, and a kind of quiet magic. Imagine lying beneath such a quilt while snow rattles against the shutters. The fabric feels heavy, almost immovable, pinning you into a safe cocoon. Children wriggle beneath it like restless kittens, feet kicking, bodies twisting, while parents murmur for stillness. The closeness makes every sound louder, a sigh, a cough, the whisper of fabric shifting, and yet the quilt muffles the worst of the cold, turning a fragile log cabin into a semblance of home. Experts disagree about just how often families manage to keep bedding dry. Some argue that in tightly sealed cabins, smoke and condensation made quilts perpetually damp, their insulation weakened by moisture. Others insist that careful drying near the hearth restored warmth each day. Perhaps both are true. Some nights, quilts clung to sleepers with clammy heaviness, while other nights, they crackled with dry warmth straight from the fire. There's something poignant about the image of children snuggling beneath a quilt stitched from your worn overcoat, traded for a week's worth of food, to wrap your children warm, hoping in return to feed them through the next week. Each piece of bedding carried enormous value, both practical and emotional. In sensory terms, the bedding often smelled strongly of whatever household chore it had last endured. Quilts reeked faintly of wood smoke, wool blankets of lanolin, feather beds of musty down. Over time, these scents became inseparable from the experience of winter nights. To the modern nose, it might seem pungent or unpleasant. To those families, it was simply the fragrance of survival. Even the act of making bedding shaped community life. Quilting bees, gatherings where women stitched together patchwork, became moments of social bonding, swapping stories and songs while their hands worked. The finished quilt represented not just protection, but also the collective labor of friends and neighbors. In this way, warmth was literally stitched by many hands, a communal effort against the loneliness of winter. Picture the rhythm of such a gathering, the scrape of needles pulling thread, the laughter echoing in a chilly room, steam rising from mugs of cider. Children ran underfoot while adults bent over fabric, creating patterns that would soon lie across beds in snowbound cabins. The quilt that resulted carried those voices within its stitches, every square a reminder that no family faced the frontier entirely alone. Of course, not every bed cover was simple, coarse, and purely functional. Old grain sacks stitched together, layered blankets, flannel sheets, each requiring different approaches to cleaning and care. Wool blankets from sources like South American Ospo, said to be exceptionally warm, could be beaten with sticks to remove dust, but wet only well away from the imminent threat of frost. Feather beds that were luxuries required mastery of care, tossed and aired daily to keep them from becoming matted and hard. In this way, in the coldest, frigid nights, it is life itself. And as you drift deeper, the quilt's weight presses away the cold, letting your mind slide softly toward dreams. The quilt presses down on you, holding in the warmth, but your attention drifts toward the edges of the cabin, the places where cold always found a way in. Even the thickest quilts or warmest bodies could be defeated by a stubborn draft, slipping through cracks.
Practical. Anything that plugged a hole kept a family alive. In sensory terms, the sealed windows carried their own atmosphere. Oiled paper, when lit from within, cast a soft amber glow, blurring faces into silhouettes. Wool rugs over doors muffled outside noise, wrapping the cabin in a strange, insulated silence. The air became thick with breath and smoke, less fresh, but safer. Imagine lying in such a room, the world reduced to flickering shadows, your ears filled only with the sound of fire crackling and the steady breathing of loved ones. Occasionally, ingenuity went further. Families placed barrels of water against drafty walls, believing the thermal mass would absorb cold air before it reached the bed. Others stacked firewood along walls to block cracks, turning supplies into insulation. These odd strategies transformed ordinary objects into tools of survival. And yet the cold always found its way back in. Diaries describe waking to snow that had drifted through keyholes or sifted between logs, dusting blankets like powdered sugar. Imagine brushing frost from your hair, shaking snow from your quilt, and realizing it had fallen inside your own home. The cabin might be sealed as best it could, but winter never stopped testing its defenses. Children grew up remembering the rituals of sealing windows as part of bedtime itself. One memoir recalled the draft hunt, when siblings competed to find the coldest crack and plug it fastest. Another described the joy of standing close to a shutter after it was patched,
proud that the icy sting had vanished. These games masked the seriousness of the task, teaching the next generation to turn hardship into habit. The debates among modern historians continue. Were frontier homes truly livable through the coldest months, or did families endure nights of near constant shivering despite all precautions? Some argue that only the healthiest survived, while others highlight the adaptability of human bodies to extreme conditions. What seems certain is that sealing windows and doors wasn't optional. It was the nightly ceremony that stood between survival and collapse. As you settle back in this imagined cabin, you feel the difference once the shutters are barred, the cracks stuffed, the quilt hung over the door. The room grows quieter, stiller, less hostile. The wind outside still howls, but it no longer bites your skin. You draw the quilt closer, sink deeper into the straw mattress, and drift towards sleep, knowing that the fortress may not be perfect, but for tonight, it is enough. The shutters are sealed now, rugs and quilts hanging thick across the cracks. But there's another form of warmth stirring in the cabin, a warmth that breathes, shifts, and occasionally snores. Families didn't always rely only on each other's bodies. They sometimes welcomed their animals into the nighttime circle. Dogs, cats, and on the harshest nights, even livestock stepped across the threshold, their presence reshaping the way frontier people endured winter. It is well recorded in farm journals and pioneer memoirs that families deliberately coaxed their cow into the cabin on the coldest nights, the animal standing near the door while children slept within arm's reach. The smell must have been powerful, the space cramped beyond belief, yet the heat from a full-bodied creature outweighed the inconvenience. "We shared the winter with our Bessie," the farmer's daughter wrote, "and never were the warmer for it." Researchers remain divided about just how common such practices were. Some argue that bringing animals inside posed too many health hazards, disease, parasites, filth. Others contend that in the direst circumstances, practicality trumped hygiene, and families did what they had to do. The absence of widespread documentation may say less about rarity than about embarrassment. After all, who wanted to admit they had slept nose to tail with their pig just to avoid frostbite? Now close your eyes and imagine the sensory detail. You're lying beneath a heavy quilt, and at your feet, a dog shifts, sighing into the straw. Its fur smells of smoke and earth, its body heat seeping through the covers into your toes. Somewhere nearby, a cat needs a blanket, its purr vibrating against the silence. And in the far corner, a goat rustles in its pen, breathing softly, the faint odor of hay mixing with wood smoke. The sounds and scents aren't refined, but they make the room feel alive, a chorus of beings resisting the winter together. One curious practice noted in Scandinavian immigrant families was the building of animal corners inside the cabin, small enclosed stalls where sheep or goats could spend the night. The warmth from these animals raised the temperature enough.
Practical. Anything that plugged a hole kept a family alive. In sensory terms, the sealed windows carried their own atmosphere. Oiled paper, when lit from within, cast a soft amber glow, blurring faces into silhouettes. Wool rugs over doors muffled outside noise, wrapping the cabin in a strange, insulated silence. The air became thick with breath and smoke, less fresh, but safer. Imagine lying in such a room, the world reduced to flickering shadows, your ears filled only with the sound of fire crackling and the steady breathing of loved ones. Occasionally, ingenuity went further. Families placed barrels of water against drafty walls, believing the thermal mass would absorb cold air before it reached the bed. Others stacked firewood along walls to block cracks, turning supplies into insulation. These odd strategies transformed ordinary objects into tools of survival. And yet the cold always found its way back in.
Diaries describe waking to snow that had drifted through keyholes or sifted between logs, dusting blankets like powdered sugar. Imagine brushing frost from your hair, shaking snow from your quilt, and realizing it had fallen inside your own home. The cabin might be sealed as best it could, but winter never stopped testing its defenses. Children grew up remembering the rituals of sealing windows as part of bedtime itself. One memoir recalled the draft hunt when siblings competed to find the coldest crack and plug it fastest. Another described the joy of standing close to a shutter after it was patched, proud that the icy sting had vanished. These games masked the seriousness of the task, teaching the next generation to turn hardship into habit. The debates among modern historians continue. Were frontier homes truly livable through the coldest months, or did families endure nights of near constant shivering despite all precautions? Some argue that only the healthiest survived, while others highlight the adaptability of human bodies to extreme conditions. What seems certain is that sealing windows and doors wasn't optional. It was the nightly ceremony that stood between survival and collapse. As you settle back in this imagined cabin, you feel the difference once the shutters are barred, the cracks stuffed, the quilt hung over the door. The room grows quieter, stiller, less hostile. The wind outside still howls, but it no longer bites your skin. You draw the quilt closer, sink deeper into the straw mattress, and drift towards sleep, knowing that the fortress may not be perfect, but for tonight, it is enough. The shutters are sealed now, rugs and quilts hanging thick across the cracks. But there's another form of warmth stirring in the cabin, a warmth that breathes, shifts, and occasionally snores. Families didn't always rely only on each other's bodies. They sometimes welcomed their animals into the nighttime circle. Dogs, cats, and on the harshest nights, even livestock stepped across the threshold, their presence reshaping the way frontier people endured winter. It is well recorded in farm journals and pioneer memoirs that families deliberately coaxed their cow into the cabin on the coldest nights, the animal standing near the door while children slept within arm's reach. The smell must have been powerful, the space cramped beyond belief, yet the heat from a full-bodied creature outweighed the inconvenience. "We shared the winter with our Bessie," the farmer's daughter wrote, "and never were the warmer for it." Researchers remain divided about just how common such practices were. Some argue that bringing animals inside posed too many health hazards, disease, parasites, filth. Others contend that in the direst circumstances, practicality trumped hygiene, and families did what they had to do. The absence of widespread documentation may say less about rarity than about embarrassment. After all, who wanted to admit they had slept nose to tail with their pig just to avoid frostbite? Now close your eyes and imagine the sensory detail. You're lying beneath a heavy quilt, and at your feet, a dog shifts, sighing into the straw. Its fur smells of smoke and earth, its body heat seeping through the covers into your toes. Somewhere nearby, a cat needs a blanket, its purr vibrating against the silence. And in the far corner, a goat rustles in its pen, breathing softly, the faint odor of hay mixing with wood smoke. The sounds and
Inventions of people facing drafts with scraps of fabric? Some scholars argue that cultural memory carried the idea across the Atlantic, while others suggest necessity reinvented the practice wherever winters demanded. In either case, the fabric shielded countless sleepers from the cruelest touch of night air. Morning brought its own rituals. Curtains were drawn aside, their folds stiff with frost at the edges. Children emerged yawning, hair static with the trapped air, while parents folded fabric carefully to protect it from sparks or damp. The bubble dissolved, and the family returned to the shared reality of the cold cabin. But for those hours of darkness, the curtain had created a fragile paradise, thin cloth between them and the wilderness. Even now, echoes linger in modern comfort. The heavy duvets and enclosed sleeping bags we take camping echo the same principle. Trap the heat, hold it close, survive the night. The ingenuity of those frontier bed curtains whispers through time, reminding us that even the simplest fabric, hung with care, could mean the difference between life and death. So, as you sink deeper into the imagined room, feel the curtain brushing softly against your skin. Hear the muffled quiet within its folds, and let the sense of enclosure reassure you. Outside, the wind rattles against the shutters. Inside, your little tent of fabric holds warmth like a secret, keeping you safe until dawn. The canopy sways faintly in your mind's eye, fabric whispering with every breath. But beneath those quilts, inside that fragile fortress of cloth, another weapon against the cold was always present: the clothes you wore to bed. Today, many imagine sleepwear as a luxury, soft pajamas, thin cotton. But on the frontier, sleep clothing was armor, layered deliberately, each piece chosen to keep death at bay. It is widely acknowledged from household records and letters that frontier families rarely stripped down at night in the way modern sleepers do. Instead, they climbed under quilts fully dressed, often in the very garments worn all day. Wool shirts, thick stockings, long undergarments, and knitted caps were part of the nightly ritual. Nightgowns existed, but only if a family had fabric to spare. For most, practicality came first. What you wore during the day, you likely wore to bed, adding layers as needed. A curious but revealing tidbit comes from journals describing nightcaps, those woolen or linen hats that kept heads from losing heat. Children wore them with flaps tied beneath the chin, giving them an almost comical look in the dark. Without them, and oral histories hint at both experiences, some families swore by heavy layering, while others learned to balance warmth with ventilation, discovering the line between comfort and clammy misery. Now, let yourself feel it. You climb beneath quilts already weighted with history. But tonight, you're wrapped in layers. Wool stockings scratch against your calves, a coarse linen shirt clings to your chest, and a cap hugs your head so tightly you hear the faint rustle of fabric with each movement. Your breath warms the inside of the cap, dampening it. But the alternative, naked skin against icy air, would be unthinkable. In immigrant households, certain traditions colored the choices of sleepwear. Scandinavian settlers often swaddled children in layers of sheepskin or fur, fastening them with strips of cloth like little winter cocoons. German families prized wool undergarments, knitted thick and long enough to cover the wrists and ankles. English settlers clung to their long shirts, garments that doubled as both day wear and night wear, simple but layered. Infrequent washing was the rule, not the exception. Wool retained odor, and linen nightshirts rarely saw soap during the long winter months. To us, the thought of sleeping for weeks in the same garments might sound unbearable, yet to them, it was simple reality. Water froze, soap was precious, and survival mattered more than scent. Diaries sometimes joke about the companionable smell of the household at night, a humor sharpened by necessity. Imagine the sensory picture more fully. You stretch your feet within coarse wool, almost impossible. Parents laughed at their bundled children, but they also knew that each extra layer meant another chance to wake with rosy cheeks instead of blue lips. Researchers remain divided on the symbolic meaning of sleepwear, too. Was it simply utilitarian, or did it carry a sense of modesty and dignity in shared sleeping arrangements? Some argue that night clothes preserved privacy in households where everyone slept side by side. Others believe modesty was a luxury frontier families could not afford. Morning stirred stiffly, peeling off night layers with reluctance. Shirts and stockings were stiff with sweat or frost, caps askew, hair flattened beneath them. The first step onto the icy floor made the body shiver, but the knowledge lingered. The clothes had done their job. They had carried you through another night. Now, as you rest in this imagined cabin, you feel the scratch of wool, the heaviness of layers, the odd comfort of a cap pulled low. It isn't glamorous, and it isn't meant to be. It is survival stitched into fabric,
worn to bed because warmth is worth more than beauty. Wrapped so tightly, you drift into sleep, grateful for every coarse thread guarding you against the darkness. The quilt presses heavy against you, your wool cap pulled low, but the fire still glows faintly in the hearth. And here, in the stillness of midnight, another kind of warmth joins the arsenal of survival. Warmth carried directly into bed. Frontier families discovered that stones, bricks, and even pieces of iron could become little suns if heated in the fire, wrapped carefully and tucked beneath quilts. These glowing bundles might seem simple, but on the coldest nights, they meant the difference between restful slumber and hours of bone-deep shivering. Evidence from diaries and household notes make it clear that the bed warmer was a beloved tool. Some households owned metal pans with long handles designed to scoop coals and slide them across the mattress before sleep. Others relied on simpler methods, bricks heated in the coals or flat river stones warmed all day by the fire. Once glowing with heat, these objects were wrapped in cloth, slipped under quilts, and left to radiate comfort through the night. The glow itself didn't last long, but for a few blessed hours it softened the icy air. One curious recollection from a settler's memoir mentions potatoes baked in the hearth, then tied in cloth and carried to bed. Children clutched them like dolls, warming small hands as they drifted off. By morning, the potatoes were cold and shriveled, but still edible, a practical blend of supper and survival. The detail might raise a smile now, but to those families, it was a clever merging of food and heat in a world that offered little of either. Researchers are still divided over how widespread such practices were. Some argue that only households with surplus firewood or iron tools could afford to waste fuel on heating stones. Others suggest the custom was nearly universal, since even the poorest cabins had access to rocks and a hearth. What is certain is that stories of hot bricks and sharp but oddly comforting heat. In a world of harsh deprivation, this small luxury feels almost extravagant. One unusual practice among Dutch immigrants involved filling earthenware jugs with hot water, corking them tightly, and slipping them under quilts. The jugs radiated warmth for hours and could be reheated easily each evening. Some families even carried them into sleighs or wagons, turning winter travel into a slightly less punishing ordeal. Imagine the clink of pottery against wooden bed frames, the steam rising as corks hissed loose in the morning. Debates among historians focus on the safety of these practices. Some argue that hot coals in pans posed enormous fire risks, especially in straw-filled cabins. Indeed, stories survive of bedding igniting, flames racing across quilts before being beaten out in panic. Others insist that the risks were manageable, pointing out that careful wrapping and experience kept accidents rare. Perhaps the reality lies in the middle. Families balanced the gamble of fire against the certainty of frost. Now, picture the rituals of evening. A child crouches by the hearth, poking a stone deeper into glowing coals. A mother checks the cloth wrapping, frowning at a singed edge. The father lifts the warm stone carefully, tongs in hand, before sliding it into the bed. The family exhales in unison when the heat spreads through the quilts. These moments carried more drama than modern households can easily imagine. The fire had to be coaxed just right, the heat captured at just the right time, the bedding adjusted to trap it all. In sensory memory, these bed warmers left powerful impressions. One pioneer recalled the smell of wool smoldering where a stone pressed too close. The fabric singed, but the warmth irresistible. Another wrote that she could always tell when the stone cooled because her dreams shifted from soft to restless, and she awoke pulling quilts tighter. The stones became part of the rhythm of sleep itself. And yet, improvisation never ended. When stones weren't available, families turned to whatever they had. Iron tools, kettles filled with hot water, even small sacks of heated sand. Some native techniques adopted by settlers used heated earth buried in pits beneath bedding, though these were less common in cabins. The creativity reveals how determined families were to harness every flicker of warmth from their environment. Children often treasured these warm bundles like companions. Letters describe youngsters naming their heated stones, carrying them from hearth to bed like cherished.
you.